In this last of 3 short videos on the nature of slavery, we'll look at slave resistance and slave revolts. Now, given all that I've talked about in the earlier videos about the brutal nature of slavery, you might wonder why there were not constant slave rebellions. You have to realize, however, that to coordinate a successful rebellion required planning and arms and supplies, and you have to communicate it, and all of that is difficult for slaves on different plantations spread out over a vast area, having nothing. And the slaves were uneducated. They didn't have knowledge about the surroundings outside of what was outside of their immediate surroundings. They stood out. They were African American, and everywhere they went there'd be a patrol. It just there was certainly a desire, obviously, for rebellion against this institution of slavery, but they were facing such stiff odds, and the monitoring with the patrol system, it's just unrealistic to expect a whole lot of slave rebellions. The slaves resisted, however, in a number of ways. There were some notable slave revolts we'll talk about, but often slaves resisted individually in other ways. Obviously, the most common way of slave resistance was simply a work slowdown. They would not appear to be resisting, but they just wouldn't work hard. And that goes back to what I was talking about, that the whites often saw African Americans as lazy because, well, the African Americans just had no motivation to work hard. They're not working for themselves, so they would deliberately work slowly or sabotage the operations of the plantation simply to as a form of resistance. Slaves were known to have burned farms or the homes of white patrol officers. Many patrol officers were hesitant to leave their homes for long periods, afraid that slaves might seek revenge, and the same was true for particularly harsh masters. While they are away, the slaves could damage their plantation, and then nobody would know. They'd just say, "Hey, it was a fire. I don't know what caused it." Self-mutilation and suicide were common forms of resistance to slavery. Slaves would cut off their toes or hands and otherwise mutilate themselves to render themselves ineffective as workers. One Kentucky slave carpenter, for example, cut off one of his hands and 2 fingers on his other one when he learned that he was to be sold to a neighboring plantation. He wanted to say he wasn't worth it, and that, by making himself unable to work, he would cancel the sale. Suicide was especially high for slaves brought straight from Africa and the continuing illegal African slave trade. You may be familiar that the international slave trade was made illegal by the Constitution. It took effect 20 years after the Constitution was ratified, but the slave trade continued. In 1810, 2 boatloads of Africans in Charleston Harbor, for example, collectively starved themselves to death. Because of the fear of being poisoned by the slave codes, many plantation whites used slave tasters to make sure the food cooking was okay. Arsenic was fairly common, and it could be quite liberal, and I assumed that the tasters didn't mind that job because they got extra food. It's interesting to look at the way slaves named their children as a form of resistance against the institution of slavery. Slaves constantly struggled to control their own lives, despite all the oppression they faced. Looking at the way they named their children, some named their children with African names, such as Cuffy, which denoted a male born on Friday. A majority chose names of British origin, but they did so with great care. Unlike free black women who gave their daughters their own names to establish a symbolic tie between generations, slave women didn't, because legally slave status was passed down through the mothers. Slave men, however, followed the opposite strategy. Because whites refused to acknowledge their legal status as fathers, many slaves named their sons after themselves. It's interesting to think about, like if you're familiar with Malcolm X, he asked why he had X as his last name. He said because he didn't know his name. His African name was taken to him by the slave owners, so X represented he was anonymous. He didn't know his name. Very common were slaves trying to run away. They would often run in the deep south into the swamps, or if they're a little bit to the west, into the mountains. But again, they didn't have a final destination because they didn't know the environment. They didn't really know which direction to go, which was best or which was worse, and so it's again difficult. Once you get out there, you got to survive, and they don't have anything to help them do with that. Some tried to forge fake passes and pose as a free black, but because they were uneducated, their passes were often so bad that it wouldn't pass as legit. The forms of resistance sometimes could get violent. I said there wasn't a lot of revolts, but there were some. Often the violence came as just frustration. An overseer might be attacked. Now that would get you harsh punishment, of course, but you just couldn't stand it anymore, and you snapped. But there were some notable rebellions. Now, other than the ones in the colonial period, one of the first notable ones in the period of the United States was attempted rebellion by Gabriel Prosser, who was a blacksmith slave outside Richmond. And in the summer of 1800, he planned to have a rebellion. He was going to organize a bunch of free blacks and slaves, and they were going to march on Richmond, where there was a governor, James Monroe, and they were going to seize the governor and demand equality. However, word got out, as it often did when you're trying to coordinate these things, and it kind of fizzled. There, trials were held, and at least 25 people were executed, including Gabriel. Following the War of 1812, the number of slave revolts increased, probably the most famous being the Denmark-Vesey insurrection. Vesey had purchased his freedom in 1800, and for about a dozen years or so, he'd made a respectable living as a carpenter in Charleston, South Carolina. He still was angry about slavery and worried that he might be tossed back into slavery, and so he used his freedom to plan an elaborate uprising. For several years, he slowly collected weapons, and he had up to 250 bayonets and 300 daggers. He sought assistance from the well-known resistance fighters in Haiti. There had been a successful rebellion in Haiti under Toussaint Louverture, and you may be familiar with that. He set the second Sunday in July 1822 for the day of his revolt, but word leaked out, and he had to move the date up a month. Word of the switch in the dates had not completely gotten out, however, and thus what ended up happening was confusion, which kind of assured disaster. There again, you see the problem of coordinating among the African Americans and the free blacks. So anyway, when the date came around, not everybody's on the same page, and it was kind of a colossal disaster. 139 African Americans were arrested, and 47 were condemned to die. The total estimates of the number of African Americans that might have been involved, had it been fully coordinated and gone as planned, reached as high as 9,000, and that would have been something had it gone off like that, because it might have had a degree of success. Also, I should note that 4 whites were convicted and severely punished for aiding the effort, but the Denmark-Vesey insurrection in South Carolina in 1822 was one of the most famous of the antebellum American slave revolts. Another notable antebellum slave revolt was that of Nat Turner in Southampton County, Virginia, 9 years later. It was 1831. Like Vesey, Turner had planned his revolt for some time, choosing August 21st, 1831 as a date because of the sun's, quote, peculiar greenish blue, unquote. He took it as a sign from God. Turner began by killing his master and his master's family. Within a day, the revolt had killed 60 whites. But the slave owners, of course, had caught out the state, and even federal troops got involved, and that kind of assured its ultimate demise. In the end, 100 slaves were killed, and later 13 slaves and 3 blacks were executed. Turner was captured on October 30th, 1831, and summarily hanged on November 11th, 1831. Nat Turner's rebellion inspired many slaves, but ultimately what it led to was a strengthening of Virginia slave codes, and that kind of follows common thread. Why were there not more slave rebellions? Well, each time there was one, the slave codes clamped down, and it even became more difficult to have the other. But between Gabriel's Revolt and Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner and a few others, you do have attempts at a rebellion. But again, most of the resistance was more individual. In any event, this concludes the third and final of the short videos on the nature of slavery.